After 8 years of service, President Reagan prepared to step aside. Reagan was incredibly popular, even with the Iran-Contra scandal still swirling around him and the various other problems that surrounded the last term in office. He was the architect of a robust new military. He had lowered taxes. He had sharply reduced inflation. Stagflation was now a memory. 8 years in the past. Unemployment was at unheard of lows, approaching 5% or less, which statistically they say is full employment as you can get. The nation was producing a prolonged economic recovery that would last until the next century. And President Reagan had signed a historic arms reduction treaty. But as he prepared to go, the contenders for his job were lining up. But many in the 1988 campaign, especially in the Democratic field, believed that this prosperity was simply an illusion. It was a figment of their imagination, and that it was a shaky recovery at best. And that much like the Gilded Age, the splendor of the 80s and the economic successes of the 80s papered over real issues and real problems. And so key Democrats prepared to run for the presidency. As Jesse Jackson stated, and I quote, "We must fundamentally reject the lie of Reaganomics," end quote. Now, understand it from his perspective. If Reaganomics, the idea of lowering taxes to increase revenue, reduced government spending, reduced government involvement, if that is true, if Reaganomics, or as George Bush will call it, voodoo economics, if that was true and if it was successful, he'd be out of a potential job. So they have to make Reaganomics appear to be false. They have to make it appear to be a lie, or as he says, the lie of Reaganomics. 12 contenders vied for the Democratic nomination in 1988, but only 2 really had public support. The Democratic frontrunner, Michael Dukakis, and his rival, the anti-establishment candidate, Jesse Jackson. And the two engaged in a bruising fight for the nomination. A fight that handed the Republicans the ammunition that they would need for the campaign. And so as the Democrats settle on their choice, a few Republicans rose to challenge the sitting vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, for the nomination. But Bush was a likable guy and was easily able to brush aside any of the challengers. In fact, he proved to be a far more strident campaigner than anybody had given him credit for. His aw shucks, nice guy approach gave way to a real steel backbone that eliminated any of his rivals that arose against him. He was a veteran politician. He had been a Texas congressman, a diplomat in China, a United Nations ambassador, and the head of the CIA. So while he was not overly charismatic, he had enough appeal and homespun charm and wisdom to not out-Reagan Reagan. Anybody following in Reagan's shadow would have been dwarfed, because Reagan was made for television. Reagan was made for reaching into the households of America through the box and touching them in ways that no president that follows has been able to do. In fact, he was easily lampooned. George Herbert Walker Bush was attacked by then Texas Governor Ann Richardson as an affluent elite. In fact, I remember seeing this speech, not live, but on TV at the 1988 Democratic Convention. Ann Richards stood on stage and she said, I can still hear it. She said it just this way, "Poor George, he can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth." Well, that may have been true, and she may have been attacking a fellow Texan. George Herbert Walker Bush had moved to Texas and had lived in Texas for a number of decades. But he had three things going for him that even Ann Richards' attacks wouldn't stop, and that was peace, prosperity, and a very popular Reagan supporting him. So as the Democrats came to focus on the Massachusetts governor, Michael Dukakis, who chose as his running mate a Texan, Lloyd Bentsen, Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen as his running mate. George Herbert Walker Bush chose as his running mate an unheard of Dan Quayle. And as the two squared off for the 1988 election, where Bush had been categorized as an elite rich boy and a wimp, he was able to stand by his war record. During World War II, he had served in the Navy as a flyer, had been shot down by the Japanese. He was able to draw on his experience from not only heading the CIA, but being a diplomat in China and being vice president for 8 years. And against that, you have a governor, Governor Michael Dukakis, who, while was very in tune with domestic policy, was extremely weak in foreign policy and military policy. And in fact, as Bush used the nomination tactics of the Democrats, and by the way, most assaults on presidential candidates don't come initially from the opposing party. They come from the nominee's own rivals in their party, and they use that as ammunition against them. So George Herbert Walker Bush's people didn't come up with Dukakis being weak on the military. It was Democrats that came up with Dukakis being weak on the military. To try to fix that, Governor Dukakis arranged a visit to the National Guard Armory, and he had the famous photo on the left taken with him in the cupola of an M1 tank. And this was then to be put out to show his strength with the military, that he was a commander-in-chief material because he had exercised authority over the Massachusetts National Guard. Well, almost immediately when throwing his war record against George Herbert Walker Bush, it didn't stand up to the muster test. And so it backfired. The public saw it for what it was, a campaign stunt, a ploy. What hurt him even worse, and this came yet again from Democratic challengers, and the George Herbert Walker Bush people took it as a gift, was Michael Dukakis' stand on crime. Now, Dukakis didn't come up with the furlough program of Massachusetts, but other governors had, and he continued it. The furlough program was this. The state decided to save bed space and to urge prisoners to good behavior and an early release. They instituted a furlough program where a prisoner could go home for the weekend. So every so often they could come up for a furlough and could go home for a weekend or up to 10 days, depending on their length of good behavior. And one of those people that had been released on furlough during Governor Dukakis' stint as governor of Massachusetts was William Horton. William Horton, and the campaign commercials called him Willie Horton. That's why it's on the slide as Willie Horton. But Willie Horton hated being called Willie. He told them, "You made me." He told the campaigns, "You made me Willie Horton. My name is William Horton," and that's what he went by. But William Horton had been one of the inmates convicted of murder, but had been released on furlough. While he was gone on his weekend furlough, he fled Massachusetts to Maryland, where he raped a woman, pistol whipped her boyfriend, stabbed her boyfriend, tied him up, and left him for dead. And so any campaign would use this against their opponent. And so it was shown as, do you want Governor Dukakis's prisoner program to be applied to the federal level? He's weak on the military. He's weak in foreign affairs. He's never served above being a governor. He has no international experience. And his domestic record, Willie Horton, isn't so good. Now, on the flip side of that, you have George Herbert Walker Bush, who in his acceptance speech at the Republican nomination said, I know if I'm elected president, the opposition is going to try to raise taxes, and I'm going to tell them no, and I'm going to continue telling them no. And when they come back to me and yet again ask for a tax increase, I'm going to say, read my lips, no new taxes. And so George Herbert Walker Bush makes this pledge to cement, especially the conservatives in the party, to his nomination. But that phrase is going to come back to haunt him. In fact, it's going to come back to haunt him and cost him the next election. But on election day, and I as a presidential scholar, attribute the election of 1988 to the popularity of Reagan as much as George Herbert Walker Bush's policies. But either way, Bush wins the day, and the Democrats get to spend 4 years stewing over who they were going to run next. While he had labeled President Reagan's economic policies voodoo economics 8 years earlier, in his domestic policy, George Herbert Walker Bush will continue most of Ronald Reagan's economic approaches. In fact, the areas in which Bush stumbles are areas where he departs from Reaganomics. And I would say that's because he truly didn't believe it. He had opposed it when he was a candidate. He had opposed it initially as vice president and had gone along with it. Now that he's the man, he's the one making the decisions, he really doesn't agree with it, but he goes along with it. And so when push comes to shove, he makes poor decisions. By 1990, the economic policies take a slight downturn, especially because of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Balanced Budget Amendment. The Graham-Rudman bill, as it was known, called for balanced budgets with no substantial increase in the deficit. If the budget became unbalanced, meaning you start spending more money than you're taking in, there were mandatory spending cuts that kicked in across the board. These set program costs and declining revenue, revenue led George Bush, though, to have a fear of growing deficits. Bush was afraid of violating the Graham-Rudman bill, and as he saw the set costs that he can do nothing about it continuing to grow, man. I've had a cold all week. Okay. Oh. All right. Fear of violating Graham-Rudman because of the set cost and declining revenue of a slight recession led President Bush to call on Congress to make targeted program cuts seen that, hey, we're not doing as well as we could, especially because, and what had caused the recession initially was a increase in the minimum wage. As the minimum wage was increased, the minimum wage bill of 1989 was instituted. Bush initially vetoed it. Said he would veto any attempts to raise the minimum wage. However, he compromised and signed the bill, which increased the minimum wage from $3.35 an hour to $4.25 an hour over the course of 2 years. So in 1990, those minimum wage increases are going into effect. And with that, this is basic economics 101. And I know if you're making minimum wage, you want it to go up. But what happens when it does go up? Well, businesses are going to have to raise their prices to cover their higher wages. Or they're going to take that next step and decide, maybe we just don't need as many people. And so they get rid of people so that people who had jobs and were paying taxes now are going to the unemployment office. And so as the minimum wage started to creep up, it was starting to impact in 1990 the economy, and a slight recession set in. And so President Bush, wanting to prevent the Graham-Rudman mandatory across-the-board cuts from kicking in. Why? Because it would affect programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and you can just imagine, because you see it all the time, what the opposition can do with cuts to Social Security. It's one of the most amazing things. If you study presidential politics, you see the president being blamed for anything that happens to Social Security when it's really Congress's job to take care of Social Security. So President Bush knew he would be blamed if cuts kicked in for Social Security or for Medicare or Medicaid. So he wanted targeted cuts rather than across-the-board cuts. But Congress is controlled by the Democrats. Speaker Tip O'Neill said not only no, but hell no, we're not going to do targeted cuts unless you give us a tax increase. Bush was stuck. If he didn't go along with the taxes, then the mandatory cuts would kick in and he would be seen as the person who caused it. If he went along and allowed the tax increase, then he would be blamed for violating a campaign pledge. So he was stuck, a catch-22. He wasn't a Reagan. He didn't go to the American people and explain it to the American people. And when he did explain it, it was too little too late. Instead, he decided to compromise with Congress, give them the tax increase, take his mandatory, his targeted cuts in programs. And what he did was set himself up for failure. The Democrats will use his violating his campaign pledge as a bludgeon to hammer him in the 1992 campaign. Bush's domestic policies then center around the recession and needs to cut programs, the needs to meet the downturn and not slip back into stagflation. But another part of his domestic policy was the slide you see on the board. President Bush, in his inaugural address and then many times throughout his presidency, made reference to 1,000 points of light. And you can see the quote, "We're a nation of communities. A brilliant diversity spreads like stars, like 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky." He believed in community service. He believed in people giving back, sacrificing of themselves to give to the community. And so he started the program, which by 1990 became an institution. It's still around today, called the Points of Light Society. And what they do is try to identify people in the community that sacrificially give of themselves to the community and identify them. And there have been a host of them. But I also remember the Saturday Night Live skits with Dana Carvey doing a beautiful impression of President Bush and making fun of Bush's. He had President Bush's movements down, and he would do 1,000 points of light and read my lips, no new taxes, and he was just brilliant at it. So much so that President Bush invited him to the White House and met him, and they did a skit side by side with President Bush making the normal gestures he would, and Dana Carvey sitting right beside him, imitating him, and it was hilarious. But his domestic program centered around voluntary service. And then another area in which carries over into foreign policy, President Bush was growing increasingly concerned about cocaine addiction in the United States in all its forms, whether that be the snorted form or crack cocaine. And so he made drug abuse and stopping drug abuse a high priority of his administration, echoing Nancy Reagan's Say No to Drugs campaign of the Reagan years. He would go so far as to create a new office within government called the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and he would appoint what was called a drug czar to oversee American drug policy. $8 billion was allocated in 1990 for better law enforcement, for education, for prevention, for treatment. But this desire to halt cocaine coming into the United States is going to lead President Bush into action against areas that supply those drugs, specifically Panama. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So President Bush's foreign policy, in his initial year in office, he had nothing to do with, except he had been vice president during most of the events that led up to it. And that was the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and then later the Soviet Union itself. By 1989, 1990, the Soviet economy was on the verge of collapse. The Communist Party chairman, Mikhail Gorbachev, instituted a couple of new policies called perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness. He reduced the strict economic budgeting of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ran on 5-year and 10-year plans, and that's what they were going to produce, what was called for in those 5-year plans, and nothing more. And so the Soviet economy was perpetually stagnant. So he calls for a reduction of the economic planning. Then he calls for a reduction in censorship within the Soviet Union. And just as an aside, one of the television shows that was incredibly popular in the United States at this time was the television show Dallas. And some have credited Gorbachev's reduction in censorship and opening up Soviet television to American programs such as the innocuous Dallas. But what the average Soviet citizen saw was that Americans enjoyed a standard of living and commodities that they only dreamed of having. And so some historians have credited the TV show Dallas for the fall of the Soviet Union. Either way, Mikhail Gorbachev, in his reduction of censorship, opens up the Soviet Union and its client states to outside influences, and he opens up the Soviet Union to U.S. trade and to reductions in military spending. You couple all of that together, and in 1989, the Soviet Union is at the end of a very long and bitter conflict. They've been fighting for 9 years in Afghanistan, a guerrilla war, a civil war. Those troops began coming home, and it's been said by other historians that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union is you have a well-trained, disciplined body of troops who come home and find that they have nothing, that their service wasn't appreciated, that their benefits were being regularly cut as the Soviet economy constricted. And it's the veterans of that Afghan war that began putting increasing pressure on the Soviet government and the Soviet economy, and that they led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But clearly, one of the things that causes the fracture that bursts wide open, Gorbachev suspends the Brezhnev Doctrine. Leonid Brezhnev had declared that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in the internal affairs of communist countries. And so, like Hungary, Poland, any of those countries that were attached to the Soviet Union via the Warsaw Pact and had communist governments, the Soviet Union had traditionally invaded if there was any type of unrest. 1989, Gorbachev suspends the Brezhnev Doctrine. And beginning in Poland, then in Hungary, then in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, communist parties began to teeter and then to topple. And at first, moderate governments come to power, and then increasingly U.S.-leaning governments come to power. And that put ever greater pressure on Mikhail Gorbachev. It kind of all came to a head on November the 9th, 1989. November the 9th, 1989. Night in Europe. The primary symbol of communism, the Berlin Wall, was breached. Just common people began testing what was taking place in Poland and Czechoslovakia. East Berliners went to the various checkpoints and began challenging East German troops to let them through into the West. And almost of itself, pressure began to grow for East Berliners to travel and visit the West. And when the government ordered the border guards to fire on the protesters if they tried to cross, the border guards refused. And on November 9th, 1989, you see it there, East Berliners began crossing into West Berlin, visiting with, in many instances, their family and friends that they haven't seen in decades. And as more and more and more people try to funnel through the checkpoints, they began tearing down the wall to widen their access. And then as the wall begins to come down, East Germany is forced to change its policies. And by October 3rd, 1990, the communist government in East Berlin collapsed, and East and West are well on their way to reunification. And so the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, kind of that edifice constructed to represent the Cold War, came tumbling down. The Warsaw Pact was then formally dissolved, and communism would begin falling around the world. And here's the irony. The man who had been the most responsible for it. And I know you get people who praise Gorbachev for perestroika and glasnost and praise him for what he did. You get people who would rather lay the responsibility for the collapse of the Soviet Union at the feet of a TV show, Dallas. But what put all of those things in position so they would happen? Well, it goes back to Harry Truman and the doctrine of containment, keeping the Soviets in check, and then Reagan at that right time, that right moment, expanding the military, expanding the Navy, putting economic pressures around the globe on the Soviet Union so that the Soviet economy reached this point of collapse. So while Reagan's not in office when it happens, and George Herbert Walker Bush is credited with it, and if you go to College Station and go to his museum, you can see a chunk of the Berlin Wall that they've put it, because he is president when it happens. But you can also go to the Reagan Museum and see a chunk. And Reagan deserves his fair credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, would it have happened without Gorbachev? Probably not. But it wouldn't have happened without Ronald Reagan either. George Herbert Walker Bush enjoys huge and immense popularity because of events Reagan sets in motion. He furthers that steel when in 1989, December of 1989, to eliminate the flow of cocaine into the United States and to make sure that the Panama Canal stayed open to American traffic, he called for Operation Just Cause. In 1983, Manuel Noriega had become leader of the Panamanian Defense Force. He was the leading general of Panama's military, which meant that he was also the de facto political leader. Panama had a fairly weak president, so Noriega could pull the strings from behind the scenes. And so while he didn't have the title of president, he certainly was in charge. And throughout the 80s, he had spied for the United States, but he had also established drug routes throughout Central South America and into North America. He had drug routes. He had set up quite the efficient money laundering operation. He had engaged in drug trafficking, political assassinations, rigging elections, smuggling operations. And in 1987 and in 1988, 2 American grand juries both indicted Noriega on trafficking charges, but also assassination charges and election fraud. When the Panamanian president in 1989 tried to have him arrested, the Panamanian General Assembly, afraid of Noriega, had the president arrested instead. And Noriega became the de facto leader of the country. In fact, the Panama Assembly would give him a new title called Maximum Leader. On December 16, 1989, he stated, "Panama is," and I quote, "is declared to be in a state of war with the United States." So December 16th, he declares war on the United States. On December 17th, at checkpoints set up along the canal zone, he stopped 4 American servicemen. And in the ensuing exchange, a Marine was killed. President Bush ordered Operation Just Cause to bring Noriega to justice, to restore the rightful government in Panama, headed by President Guillermo Endara. And on December 20th, 5 military task force of over 24,000 personnel hit strategic targets throughout Panama. After 5 days of combat, Noriega took refuge in the Vatican's embassy in Panama. Now, the Vatican has more like a consulate, but it's still protected by diplomatic safety. And so Noriega goes into the Vatican's embassy and refuses to come out. And so the U.S. barricades him in the embassy, and what it then ensues are 10 days of hell. You can appreciate the Vatican's diplomats stuck in their embassy, and the military sets up speaker systems all around, and all night, all day, they play AC/DC and Kiss and all of the hard rock of the 1980s. They play it at incredibly high volumes. At night, they light up the place with spotlights so that they deprive Noriega of sleep. So engaging in basically every form of psychological warfare they can, because Vatican embassy is diplomatically protected and the military's not going to go in, so they have to make Noriega want to come out. And so he surrendered on January 3rd, 1990. January 3rd, 1990. And was immediately sent to trial, convicted, put in American prison. Later, he was extradited to France. I believe now he's back in Panama serving. Could be in France, but anyway, he's still alive, but he's in prison. President Bush would follow his success with Noriega with the CSIC summit, meeting off the coast of Malta in the Mediterranean. They would actually not meet on land very often. Most of the meetings took place on ships. And the way they had the schedule arranged is the Soviet delegation stayed on the Slava, the American delegation stayed on the USS Belknap, and they were going to alternate between the two as meeting sites. Well, because of the small nature of these cruisers and the high seas, they had to bring in a Soviet ocean liner, the Maxim Gorky, for the meetings to take place. And so Mikhail Gorbachev and George Herbert Walker Bush meet. Now, the meeting resulted in no substantive agreements, but the two discussed further arms reductions. And as Bush stated during the meeting, he said, and I quote, "The world is at the threshold of a brand new era of U.S.-Soviet relations." 6 months later, the two meet in Washington, D.C. There's a meeting between, I know I advanced to start one, but there's a meeting between, this is the Moscow summit. 6 months later, the two meet in Washington, D.C. on May 1990, and Bush and Gorbachev sign a number of treaties. And during this meeting in Washington, Gorbachev says in a press conference, he says, and I quote, "The Cold War is behind us. Let us not wrangle over who won it." End quote. The Cold War is behind us. So if we take 1946, or we could even go back to the Potsdam Conference as the start of the Cold War, then the Washington Conference of May of 1990 is the end of the Cold War. With the Washington Conference, events in the Soviet Union began to speed up. Gorbachev faced a coup by Soviet hardliners who wanted to keep the Communist Party in power and to restore the Soviet Empire. So he faced a coup attempt on August 18th, 1991. They failed to seize key facilities and key people like Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who quickly became the face of Soviet reform. everywhere across the Soviet Union. Statues were being torn down. Republics began to break away. 15 Soviet republics broke away. 3 countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, reestablished their independence. And then the Moscow summit, kind of the catalyst for that breakaway, July 31st, 1991, Gorbachev and Bush signed the START I treaties that Bush announces the U.S. would destroy its stockpile of nuclear weapons on land and sea that are in Europe and Asia, so the elimination of American nuclear weapons in Europe and Asia. He announced that the Strategic Air Command would be taken off of 24-hour alert status, and that the U.S. would be entering into negotiations with the Soviet Union for reducing ICBMs. And thus, the START I treaty is the reduction in those ICBMs and reduction in delivery platform. So not only is the Cold War over in speech, it's over in fact, as now the two countries began pulling away from the edge. Bush's greatest success, though, in foreign policy will take place in the Middle East. On August 2nd, 1990, a former American ally and client, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, I always jokingly called him so damn insane, so it's hard to pronounce it correctly, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, attacked his neighboring country, Kuwait. For years, Saddam had been our ally in the region, balancing Iran, receiving American aid, because after 1979, Iran was viewed as more of a threat than Iraq. And from 1980 through 1988, Iraq and Iran were at war. And so the United States was more than happy to provide both sides with the weapons to kill each other off. But on August 8th, 1988, Iran and Iraq reached a truce. On August 9th, the day after, Kuwait decided to raise its oil production, and the resulting increase in production dropped oil prices across the region, which hurt Saddam Hussein in Iraq because his economic recovery was dependent on the high petrodollar, on the barrel of oil being high priced. As the price of oil drops, he's losing money, and he's deeply in debt to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to the tune of some $30 million. And he wants to expand Iraq in the region so that Iraq is the region's superpower. So, on August the 2nd, 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait, and he's surprised when everybody's ticked off about it. In fact, he had thought in his talks with the U.S. ambassador that the United States wasn't that concerned about Kuwait. So, he invades Kuwait. The UN Security Council votes 14-0. This is a clear sign that the Cold War is over. The Soviets would have opposed this just because it was a U.S.-led initiative, but the UN Security Council votes 14-0 to condemn the invasion and demand that Saddam withdraw from Kuwait. On August 6th, the Security Council passed UN Security Resolution 661 to embargo all trade against Iraq. President Bush condemned Iraq's naked aggression, and on August 5th, he stated, "This aggression will not stand." And then when asked by a reporter, well, how are you going to make this aggression not stand? President Bush, in one of the classic responses to a reporter, said, "Just wait, watch, and learn." And so beginning in August 6th, 1990, American troops and planes were sent to Saudi Arabia to bolster the Saudi Air Force and the Saudi ground forces. British sent forces as well. And George Bush began building a coalition of nations to oppose Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. This was dubbed Operation Desert Shield. Desert Shield, the protection of Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein invading Saudi Arabia from Kuwait. On November 8th, 1990, President Bush doubled the U.S. commitment to Saudi Arabia, increasing U.S. strength to 400,000 troops. And then the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 678, calling for Iraq to be removed from Kuwait, and set a deadline of January 15th, 1991. Saddam refused to back down, thinking the world was bluffing. He even refused to meet with U.S. representatives until 3 days before the deadline. He finally met with Secretary of State James Baker. Congress debated the issue and reluctantly passed a resolution authorizing the president to use force. Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, Democrat from Maine, warned that, and I quote, "A grave decision for war is being made prematurely. There has been no clear rationale, no convincing explanation for shifting American policy from one of sanctions to one of war," end quote. But then stories began coming out of Kuwait of how Saddam's army was raping and pillaging Kuwait. On January 12th, the use of force resolution passed the U.S. House 250 to 183 and the Senate 52 to 47. What does that tell you? It tells you that there is a partisan divide on the use of force in Kuwait. That clearly the Democrats who control Congress don't want to hand President Bush any victories that he could use in the coming election. They couch it in a stand on principles that we had no business there, but future events bear that out as the lie that it really is. They simply didn't want George Herbert Walker Bush, who was already becoming immensely popular because of the decline of the Soviet Union and his success in Operation Just Cause, to have yet more success. Plus, President Bush puts together an amazing coalition of nations. This is not the United States acting alone. He puts 28 countries together, committing, Japan, by its constitution, can't send combat forces, but Japan could send medical forces. So countries like Japan, bound by their constitution, show their support in the ways that they can. 16 nations commit ground forces, 3 of those countries being other Arab nations. And so it's a broad-based coalition. When the deadline passes on January 15th, Saddam Hussein is still in Kuwait. And on the night of January 17th, Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm. Missiles and planes began hitting radar, ground installations, anti-aircraft installations, all throughout Kuwait and Iraq. A massive bombing campaign. The Persian Gulf War, as Saddam Hussein said, would be the mother of all battles. And it was intense and deadly, lasting 6 weeks. This was the first real televised war, with camera crews getting close-up action, American reporters at times seeming to even help the enemy Wolf Blitzer on CNN back in the day when he was just a reporter. I remember one of his broadcasts. He's sitting at the end of an airstrip in Saudi Arabia broadcasting, and as American planes are taking off, he's broadcasting. Well, there goes another F-16 headed northeast from such and such an airfield. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to, calculate how soon that plane will be over enemy airspace. And so it became some question of how close the military should allow the television crews to the action. And the nation was treated to a nightly televised war in which smart bomb footage of Maverick missiles homing in on a laser beacon, going down chimneys, going down smokestacks, going through windows into targets, surgically destroying their target. Americans came to believe that this was a surgically precise war, not realizing that I think smart bombs were something like 6% of all the ordnance dropped, but that's what they saw on TV. That became the reality. In fact, American planes, American bombers dropped 88,500 tons of bombs and missiles on Iraq and Kuwait, decimating Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard. The Allies controlled the air. And once his air force was gone, Saddam had to find some way to interdict, to prevent American air power from having exclusive control on the ground. And so he began setting fire, as you see in the bottom picture, began setting fire to oil wells throughout Kuwait. And the thick black smoke created a dense layer of smoke over Kuwait that prevented a lot of sorties against ground targets. Now, American radar and such, it didn't stop all, but it did prevent some. So blackening the skies with oil fires to deny. Then, as an extreme move, he began launching Scud missiles from Iraq into Israel, trying to provoke an Israeli response that if Israel got into the war, it would bring the three Arab nations supporting the coalition out and could fracture the coalition. And so President Bush then had to be diplomat to Israel and posted American Patriot missile batteries in Israel to shoot down the incoming Scud missiles. And so success followed success. You would hear the air raid sirens of the incoming Scud missiles, American Patriot batteries firing. It's all captured on film. Patriot missiles rushing out, destroying the Scud in the air. And it appeared that the United States was dominating, and appearance was in fact reality, was dominating the conflict. Then General Norman Schwarzkopf, and you see the two generals I put in the previous slide. General Colin Powell is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's the general advising President Bush. And the field commander was Stormin' Norman, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who ran the ground campaign. Saddam Hussein was prepared for an attack in the south. That's where he posted his elite Republican Guard. And you can see on the map all of the units he posted along the Kuwait-Saudi border and the Iraqi-Saudi border to prevent an invasion up the coast and even inward. Schwarzkopf's strategy, though, called for forces to race across the desert in a wide sweep around and behind Saddam's forces, cutting off Kuwait from Iraq. And that's what you see on this map from the West Point Atlas series. And so as the ground war commenced, American tanks and armored fighting vehicles fared quite well in the assault. The ground assault lasted 4 days and ended up on what was known as the Highway of Death. And you see that in the upper picture, the the highway of death. As the Republican Guard realized it was going to be cut off and destroyed in Kuwait, they began fleeing backwards down the highway connecting Kuwait to Iraq. And on that highway, American tanks, American planes were just destroying Iraqi armor and any vehicle that moved. After 4 days of this, President Bush declared that this was no longer war, but was simply murder. As one UN official stated, and I quote, "Bombing had wrought near apocalyptic results upon the infrastructure of what had been, until January 1991, a rather highly urbanized and mechanized society," meaning that of Iraq. And so on February 28th, 1991, Saddam Hussein and George Bush reached a ceasefire agreement, and Kuwait was declared liberated, and the war was temporarily stopped. Now, sanctions would be put in place, no-fly zones in the north and the south of Iraq. And so even as Saddam pulls back to Iraq and declares the war a victory, he begins persecution of minorities within his own country. The Shiite Muslim population in the north, especially the Kurds, came under increasing opposition and persecution, setting the stage for the later Gulf War of the 2000s, which we'll talk about later. The last real campaign of the Bush presidency was a humanitarian. President Bush, being a former UN ambassador, having spent a lot of time at the United Nations, was very sensitive to United Nations directives. And the United Nations had been providing humanitarian relief in the country of Somalia. Security Resolution 794 called upon the United States to help in the delivery of the humanitarian supplies to the people of Somalia. The warlords had been taking the supplies, and the people were still starving, but the warlords were keeping the supplies. And so Operation Restore Hope, begun in December of 1992, and as you can see, will continue into 1993, the next presidency, is an attempt by the military to escort and to deliver supplies. It's not a matter of regime change. It's not a matter of intervening in the Civil War. It's simply a humanitarian mission to help out the suffering people of Somalia. But 1992 is an election year. It's an election year, and it's an election year in which President Bush went into the campaign season with popularity soaring around 90%. One of the highest presidential, well, the highest presidential rating until that of his son, George W. Bush, in the 2000s, who reached something like 97%. But extremely popular. And so the question then becomes, who will the Democrats find to challenge Bush in an election that it appears they're certain to lose? But that's the subject for next time.